This video is brought to you by Brilliant. Keir Starmer is facing a diplomatic dilemma. In the past week or so, a number of publications have discussed Starmer's tightrope walk between closer relations with Brussels and the so-called special relationship with the US under Trump. Navigating this successfully might be difficult given Trump's apparent disdain for the EU, and how Starmer proceeds will be a real test of his leadership. In this video, we'll discuss Starmer's US-EU balancing act and how he might handle it going forward. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. But first, let's recap the recent elections from the UK, US and EU. The EU held its elections first back in June. While more parliamentary seats were won by the far right this year, the most influential EU positions were appointed to centrists. There's EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Council Antonio Costa, and EU Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas. Starmer shares a lot of common ground with them, and is ideologically fairly well matched. Next, in July, the UK brought in a new centrist government under Labour leader Keir Starmer. Starmer made a reset of UK relations with the EU, which had been severed by the Brexit vote in 2016, a cornerstone of his campaign, and once in power, Labour said they were seeking a security pact with the EU. In October, the UK concluded negotiations on the UK-EU Competition Cooperation Agreement, and this week the civil service also put out a job advert for a new EU negotiator to act as a Sherpa for Starmer and collaborate on trade, security and border policy. However, the US elections threw a spanner in the works. In November, Republican candidate Donald Trump was re-elected, after a campaign centered around making the US a standalone superpower. In early 2024, Trump sparked concern within the UK and EU, when he said he'd encourage Russia to attack NATO member states that don't meet the 2% defense spending target. During his first term, Trump likened Brussels to a hellhole, imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium imports from Europe, and threatened to impose tariffs of up to 25% on European cars. We'll come back to tariffs momentarily, but the point we're making is that Trump will likely be a difficult partner for both the UK and EU. Now, this brings us on to Starmer's current dilemma, which is if Trump effectively forces him to choose whether he should pick the US as his best buddy or the EU as his meilleur ami. There are several issues this might affect: trade, foreign policy, defence and the climate. So let's take the biggest issue: trade. As we covered in a recent video, the UK has been angling for a trade deal with the US since at least 2020, when Boris Johnson and Trump were in office. But this hasn't led to anything, and on the EU side, Brexit has left the UK in a trade and regulation limbo. Trump has pledged to introduce at least 10% import tariffs on foreign goods, which would pressure the EU into expanding its market, but could potentially allow Starmer to side with the US to avoid a trade war. However, a lot depends on whether any kind of tariff exemptions for the UK or other trade deal with Trump requires a radically different approach to regulation compared to that with the EU. Because if the inconsistencies are too big, it would make it more difficult for Starmer to get closer to the EU. This would likely cause him political problems too. A recent Jail Partners poll for iNews suggested the UK public would overwhelmingly prefer the EU to the US as a trade partner, with 58% of the roughly 2,000 people surveyed saying Europe is the UK's most important market, and only 27% saying the US is. Next is foreign policy. Trump's America First policy is avowedly isolationist, meaning he's not really interested in foreign conflicts or diplomacy. His ambiguity towards Ukraine has already raised fears in Brussels, where MEPs are preparing for the eventuality that US military support for Ukraine will soon cease. Given the US is by far Ukraine's biggest donor, it's hard to imagine either Ukraine's European allies or the UK continuing their support for much longer if Trump stops his. Nevertheless, whatever Trump decides to do, the UK and EU will likely align their responses. Another divisive foreign policy issue is Israel. Starmer and the EU have confirmed they'll comply with the ICC's arrest warrant for Netanyahu if he travels to the UK or EU, which could potentially complicate relations with Trump. While Trump's Israel policy isn't yet clear, and he's wavered about whether or not he actually likes Netanyahu, support for Israel in the US is generally higher and less of a partisan issue than in the UK or EU. So it could become a thorn in the transatlantic relationship. Next is defence. Traditionally, the US has a strong defence partnership with the EU through NATO, but Trump has made clear his disdain for the alliance, and Europe is no longer confident it can rely on the US's support. However, the US and UK are far closer military partners than the UK is with the EU. Since 2007, the UK and US have been partners in the Defence Trade Cooperation Treaty, and in July, the US's ambassador to the UK said the UK is the US's closest military and intelligence partner in the world. This is likely to continue under Trump, even if US funding of NATO doesn't, and while that's plausibly a good thing for Starmer, it could nevertheless undermine the UK's defence relationship with the EU. Fourth and finally is climate change. As we saw at COP29 when Starmer and Ed Miliband, the UK's Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, announced an ambitious target of cutting carbon emissions by 81% by 2035 compared to 1990 levels, the UK is trying to take a lead on climate issues. This could intensify divisions between Starmer and Trump, a well-known climate change denier, who wants to boost the US's oil and gas production and has threatened to, again, withdraw the US from the 2015 Paris Accord. So, what options does Starmer have to balance both the EU and the US under Trump? Well, there's possibly two ways of viewing this, the optimistic one and the pessimistic one. The optimistic take is that post-Brexit Britain has given the UK a unique opportunity to carve out its place in the world, offering Starmer a pick and mix of different policy alignments. This is what former European Trade Commissioner Lord Peter Mandelson, tipped to become the next ambassador to the US, likens to having our cake and eating it, i.e. seeking deals with the US in areas like defence and digital trade, while also continuing Labour's current reset with the EU on trade, security and climate. Alternatively, pessimists might argue that the UK has been left without any mates at all. The UK is now in uncharted territory with the EU, while also having to navigate through choppy Trumpian waters alone, without being thrown overboard. In this reading, there's a real danger that Starmer's decision doesn't satisfy either side, leaving the UK as isolated as ever. As you've hopefully realised after an 8-minute video explaining Starmer's foreign policy dilemma, you'll have noticed that here at TLDR News, we're committed to helping you learn. Fortunately, the sponsor of today's video shares this commitment and is one of the best websites on the internet to help you learn new skills from the ground up. That website is, you guessed it, Brilliant. Now, one of the best things about Brilliant is, rather than simply throwing information at you and testing you on it, Brilliant teaches you by doing. Each of their lessons is filled with hands-on activities in problem solving that helps you actually play with the concepts. This is proven to be 6 times more effective than simply watching lecture videos. And what's more, Brilliant actually helps you do all of this learning wherever you are. You can complete their lessons on your phone, so you can easily utilise any spare minutes you have in the day with actually worthwhile learning. You can try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, so click on the link in the description. That way you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks for watching the video, and thanks for Brilliant for supporting this video.